You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs program, recording this Wednesday, January 28th, 2020. Each week we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond. Welcome, Western Standards publisher Derek Fildebrandt from Calgary.
Hello. Or should I say hello?
Hello, Derek. And welcome also Dave Naylor, our news editor, also from Calgary. Is that right?
Paul, it is.
I thought so. You know, I didn't have it in my notes.
About today's show, so let's get right to it.
My memory is it doesn't always fail me. And hosted by myself, digital editor Paul Holmes from Victoria, British Columbia. And the topics this week are gun sales, Aaron O'Toole, Peter MacKay, the Teck Oil Sands Project, the coronavirus, and we'll see what else we end up talking about this week. But why don't we kick it off with...
Surely we won't go down any tangents.
Absolutely no tangents on this show, folks. We're going to kick it off with gun sales. Dave, why don't you give us the very latest breaking news?
Well, today figures were revealed by the Canadian Firearms Commissioner that since Justin Trudeau came to power, sales of restricted automatic weapons have actually gone up almost 24%. And most people seem to credit that with the fact, well, Trudeau said he was going to ban them. So people rushed out to buy them to make sure they could get them before the ban came in.
Seems like a sort of natural human response when something's going to be banned and you want to have one of those things, right? Derek, what do you think?
Oh, I think it's great news. The only thing I like more than more gun stories is more guns. So this was a 24% increase in restricted firearm sales. I should specify that's restricted, not all guns. So the vast majority of guns in Canada are not restricted. They're typical long guns that you'd use for shooting clays or ducks and targets. These are restricted firearms, so all pistols, all handguns, and some long guns that the government thinks are too scary for people to have, most of which I think are misclassified, but it's not really the point of this. It's so the restricted firearms, the legally recorded sales have gone up by 24% in just the first 3 years of his time as Prime Minister. That is a gun boom in Canada, and those sales were disproportionately in the West, although they're obviously across the country. And it adds to the stats already that when you take all legal firearms into account, Canada's already the seventh most heavily armed civilian population in the world. There is a big gap between the first, United States, and the second, but in that second tier, Canada is near the top. And this points to people being obviously afraid that the government's going to come and take their otherwise lawful property. And times are booming for guns.
So we are the seventh most heavily armed country in the world.
Civilian population.
Civilian, yeah. Well, that's, yeah.
Yeah, if we were ever invaded, I don't think our military could do terribly much. We don't have much of one. But I think farmers and pitchforks with their gopher guns could do quite a bit.
So, what? How does this align with the mythos of Canada being this peaceful, practically gun-free country that we imagine being, I guess, neighbors to the United States? I assume that the United States is the most, or very close to the most heavily armed civilian population in the world on that list.
Well, it's kind of a part of Canada doesn't have any great founding myths the way most nations do. The United States has the American Revolution and the great founding fathers and the War of Independence, these great founding myths that nations almost have to have, especially if you are a colonial nation as we are, not an old European or Asian old world nation state, but something fashioned sort of out of the wilderness. And so Canada's founding myths were invented sort of post-World War And we mostly just said we're North American, but not American. So we've unfortunately defined ourselves not in terms of what we are, but in terms of what we're not. Americans have private healthcare, so we'll have government healthcare. Americans have guns, so we won't have guns. But that's never, these false founding myths have never been rooted in terribly much more than political propaganda. Canadians don't have as many guns as Americans. We don't have a constitutional right to bear arms as they have with the Second Amendment United States. But gun ownership is very much a part of Canada's culture, particularly in rural and Western Canada, where those founding myths have never really taken hold to the same degree. And I love it. I mean, if I was to flip my camera around right now, you'd see a small armory hanging on my wall. But it's...
I, in contrast, have nothing hanging on my wall.
Well, you're in an undisclosed location for waterboarding, so
we had to get that out somewhere in the episode. So,
this is this kind of myth is very much a part of the two Canadas that doesn't really bear that much semblance in reality. We have more guns than I think any nation in Europe, except for I think Switzerland.
But don't you think, Derek, that Canadians would be surprised? Unless they're gun enthusiasts, the average Canadian walking down the street, you say we are the 7th most heavily armed civilian population in the world. Don't you think most Canadians would be really surprised to hear that?
Well, actually, it surprised me, and I'm a gun enthusiast. I believe very strongly in firearms rights. I've got my own collection, but it surprised even me when I was doing the research. I mean, when I'm talking about ranking nations by their civilian gun ownership, I'm talking about legal ownership. I'm not talking about illegal. I imagine Somalia would be pretty high up there with illegal gun ownership, and that's not where we want to be. But what this will interestingly do is when the Liberals, they haven't really defined it yet, when they bring in their ill-defined gun bans, this will take a bunch of guns. I think they're going to be surprised by how few people are willing to hand over their stuff to the government just because they said so. So a lot of people are just going to bury their guns or hide them at the cabin or something. So Canada's illegal gun numbers will probably skyrocket, while our legal gun numbers go down. That doesn't mean there'll be any more guns off the streets. And I personally know quite a few people, and I intend to be one myself, who's going to buy a bunch of these things before they ban them.
Yeah, with the exception of Alberta, is this mostly an urban-rural issue? I mean, if I lived in Toronto and had, or for that matter, Surrey, and, you hear about gun violence happening, it's mostly obviously with illegal guns. But it happens in down the road for a lot of people, right? So they're, they have I think you could argue a very natural fear of guns, because they know that people get shot in their city. Whereas I think, the duck hunter or the farmer is trying to deal with the gopher problem. They just don't see guns the same way. And I wonder if our government appreciates and understands, that these are two different issues and, two very different perceptions. And how is there a way in this country that we can bridge those two things?
Well, I think I've got several friends in Calgary that are avid gun enthusiasts. They have probably just as many weapons as Derek in their houses, if not more. The shooting clubs are just a huge, almost booming industry. You try and go one weekend and you just can't get in. There's so many people there. People are booking parties and wedding parties and stuff like that. So I think a lot of people in urban areas enjoy shooting. Most of them don't have their own guns. They go and rent what they want at the shooting gallery. And as Derek says, the government hasn't even defined what they're going to ban yet. So
right.
Lots of
this is what I'm wondering. I mean, are they going to recognize this urban-rural divide and act appropriately, or are they going to just ban? This is a scary-looking gun, so we're going to ban it everywhere, including the duck farm in
Well, there's a few angles to this. There's a few angles to it. So they're going to ban what they call, I'll put in quotes, military-style assault rifles. Mm-hmm. That's problematic because assault rifles have been banned Under the last Trudeau, in the early 1970s, they were banned.
Right.
If you own an assault rifle today, you will go to jail. They will take your gun license and they will put you in jail. So I think there are 0 people in Canada who own legal military-style assault rifles. But they also talk about just military style. What does that mean? No one's defined that. It's essentially just guns that look scary. So I've got a friend who's got an SKS. It's just a pretty standard semi-automatic gun. Again, most of them don't even understand what semi-automatic means. But
that's like Rambo, right?
Yeah, but he's kind of tricked it out, replaced it with carbonite stock, the wood stock with composite and whatnot, and it looks like something Rambo would carry up the Mekong. But it's just a pretty traditional gun, and you can actually go deer hunting with it if you want. But that presumably could very well be banned because it looks scary. So we don't really know what they're going to ban. In terms of the urban-rural divide, they've said in the legislation, which has not yet been tabled, that they're also going to give municipalities the right to ban handguns. I'm not sure what that's going to do because most people who don't own handguns in Canada don't understand how onerous it is. So to own a handgun, you have to be a member of a gun club. You have to go through very extensive background checks. You've got to go through an extensive process to purchase it. You have to go through a very onerous storage process to keep the gun in your own home. If you want to take the gun to the range, you have to call the RCMP's Chief Firearms Officer's office and tell them the exact route along which you're going to take and if you're going to stop to go to the bathroom along the way. It's practically the closest thing you can have to a ban without it. So, but if they ban it, say in Calgary, I'm not sure how they're going to stop guns from Chestermere or Cochrane from passing through it. It's really a very nonsensical idea that's just going to make criminals out of a lot of otherwise law-abiding people.
Well, I think we could conclude the segment by saying, Dave, when I come visit you guys in spring, I do expect a surprise party at the gun range. So make sure that happens, all right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It'll be a blast. It'll be a blast.
And I'm going to shoot every single one of Derek's guns, the ones that are operational.
I think we need to do a special edition from the Shooting Edge in Calgary, and we'll just have to find a quieter room because it's a rather noisy place.
I can imagine. Yeah, there's a bit of background noise. Over to the Conservative leadership race, we have a formal campaign kickoff, as I understand. Is that right, Dave, with Aaron O'Toole?
Yeah, Peter MacKay announced on the weekend he was officially in. Aaron O'Toole, Ontario MP. He's from Durham, which is sort of outlying Toronto. He threw his hat into the ring this week, and the two of them immediately sort of got into a pride parade debate, with each one of them trying to clamor over the other one to say they would march in the debates. But O'Toole put a bit of a caveat on his. He said he would not march in any debates that had banned police officers.
Right.
And, a lot of the major pride parades do ban police officers. So.
Well, and actually, it's good. I've been in pride parades myself. I have not attended the last two in Victoria precisely because they did that. Like, why is it that an organization that existed to lift up people, from an identifiable and historically discriminated against group discriminating doesn't make any sense to me. So I assume Aaron O'Toole is more in alignment with my thinking on that for sure. But
it is a very hot button issue for people. As you said, Paul, people can't really understand why the pride organizers are banning the police. O'Toole being a former longtime military person, he's probably coming from that angle.
Sure. Yeah. And for sure.
It's curious. I mean, I think for a very long time, pride parades were an important statement for an oppressed people, for them to come out of the closet and show that they're not afraid. The first few pride parades in Calgary, people wore masks. It was roughly a dozen people, and they wore masks for fear of reprisals, either violence or being fired from their jobs. So even wearing a mask was a very brave thing to do, and I think it was necessary, trying to normalize the gay and lesbian community in the eyes of people and pushing for equal rights. But it's now become, in this intersectional madness, the leadership of many of these pride societies has been hijacked by radical intersectional social activists. Mm-hmm. And they're banning police officers, in some case military and whatnot, because they're, police would be used to raid bathhouses back in the day. But that's immaterial. Most of these police forces have had their historical apology sort of tour, and no one there is even, most of them are several generations removed from active duty of anyone who did those kinds of things. And it seems odd to me that they're trying to, not just that they're excluding someone from an organization that's supposed to be about inclusion, but they're not taking a victory, showing this huge symbol of acceptance from the military, from police. And what's really interesting is there are two groups opposed to police marching in uniform and pride parades: the pride societies and homophobes. Homophobes don't want to see the police marching in these parades. They're like, oh, this is denigrating the uniform. They shouldn't be involved in this. So people who are actually do have some lingering bigotry towards the gay and lesbian community, they want to ban police from marching in these things. And simultaneously, the extreme intersectional social justice warriors want to ban them. And so I think politically this has become a hot potato. McKay has come out and said these are critical and important and whatnot. And O'Toole's come out and said, I'd be happy to march in them if they stop this silliness. And I think that's probably a more balanced perspective to take in something like this. But it is interesting to see how parades are becoming sort of this litmus test line in the sand.
Yeah, I know in Vancouver, they banned a department at UBC because they hosted speakers that they didn't like. And I actually did if you go to the Western Standards YouTube channel, I actually did an interview with the UBC Free Speech Club's executive director, and they actually brought in that controversial speaker that ended up inevitably getting UBC banned from the Vancouver Pride Parade. So, there is a lot of silliness, and I would, again, I don't identify with the LGBTQ community myself, so I'm only an outlier, an outsider looking in. But the whole thing just does seem a bit ridiculous. Anyway, let's move along. Teck Oil Sands project, Dave. Why don't you bring us up to speed on what's happening there and the implications that there may be some tie-in with the carbon tax as well, as I understand.
Well, Teck is a giant project proposed for northern Alberta. During its construction, it'll create 7,000 jobs in a province where those jobs are desperately needed. And when it's done, it'll pump out 260,000 barrels of oil a day. It's been undergoing an environmental assessment since, the dinosaurs were here, it seems like. The province has come to agreement, or the company's come to agreement with 14 Indigenous bands in the area. So it's all systems go except for federal approval. Environment Minister yesterday in Ottawa hinted that, the government approval may hinge on what Alberta is doing with its carbon tax. The minister noted that Alberta is currently in court trying to oppose the federal carbon tax. And he's basically calling on the province to do more to help Canada get their net emissions down to zero by 2050. So there's some very, very deep implications there on what it may mean. Government's supposed to rule by the end of February on it, but they're already talking about delaying. So, we could be in the old retired journalism home before these guys get it approved.
What's the, I understood that there was a fairly established process for approval of projects like this. And, you had to tick the boxes and go through the process. And it sounds like the companies behind this did a lot of that legwork. But I guess is it part of the standard process, Derek, for a minister to approve it at the end of that whole application and review process?
It wasn't before, but it very much is now. So if you remember, Justin Trudeau jumped on with the NDP, the Green Party, and the other extreme green groups in trying to discredit the previous approval process that we had before. It certainly wasn't perfect, but it had a lot more certainty. And then they brought in Bill C69 and C48, which were vigorously opposed by not just the energy industry, but by a lot of major industries that do major infrastructure projects. And now it is a very politically loaded process. You can go through and do everything, but at the end of the day, the politicians have a much more direct say in its approval or disapproval. So this is now going to be par for the course, and I think what it's going to increasingly do is discourage major investors from even bothering to apply, because it's not like you're not going to spend any money before you apply. You will spend millions or tens or even hundreds of millions, as we see with Trans Mountain, on this kind of project before you even know if you can build it. So why would, without any kind of certainty, why would anyone go forward and do this? I think anyone who invests in these kinds of projects is a madman now in Canada. And if not for the fact that this project's been going forward for some time, I don't think they would have started it today for the uncertainty of it. But it's interesting. So the feds are saying, implying very strongly, saying so in everything but plain English, that Alberta needs to get on board and fully embrace Ottawa's carbon tax, or this might not get approved. That's bunk for a few reasons. First of all, Alberta has a carbon tax. The NDP had a carbon tax, and they called it a carbon levy. The Tories canceled what they called the carbon tax, and they kept 4/5 of that carbon tax and nearly all of the regulations around the energy industry in Alberta, and they just renamed it the TIER program, which is an acronym for something, technology innovation something program here. They kept almost the entire NDP program in place, except for the consumer carbon tax. They still have to place the industrial carbon tax, which is 2/3 of it, and most of the regulations. So Ottawa complaining that Alberta is not supporting a carbon tax is pure politics, just as it is on the Alberta government side when they say they don't have a carbon tax, because they very much do. At the same time, why should Ottawa have anything to do with this whatsoever? This is inside of Alberta's borders. This does not affect the rest of the country. This doesn't affect the rest of the world unless you're one of the apocalyptics. This should be purely Alberta's business. We shouldn't. I don't think Alberta should be even engaging the federal government on this. We should tell them to butt out. For the simple reason that, can we imagine for a second the federal government even having a question mark over if Quebec was allowed to engage in a major infrastructure project? So when Quebec builds hydro dams, those are extremely disruptive to the environment. They're often a good idea, but they are extremely disruptive, much more disruptive than most oil sands mines. And can anyone on the show, any one of our listeners, recall a single time that Ottawa threatened Quebec to fall in line with some of its policies in order for to have permission to go forward with an energy product? No, because Quebec would split overnight if they were ever condescended to that way. So I think Alberta's, it's wild what Ottawa's doing, but I think Alberta's government is being very weak in just fighting for the project. It should be telling Ottawa it has no business in this whatsoever, and if they insist on inserting themselves into it, they should be prepared to go it alone with the many reasons Albertans and Westerners more broadly already have to seek independence.
All right. Well, on one final note, a public service announcement. If you are a consumer of Corona beer, don't worry, you're not going to get the coronavirus from your beer. Well, I don't want to say that with 100% certainty, but let's just say it's probably not going to happen that way, unless you share your beer with somebody who has the coronavirus, in which case, that's problematic. But a funny article posted today from Vice, of all sources, and yes, I read right, left, and otherwise, and it was all about how the number of searches for the corona beer virus has gone up dramatically on Google. People clearly not connecting the coronavirus with corona meaning crown, and this virus coming out of China, not the beer making regions of Mexico. So
well, very clearly the human race is beyond redemption, and perhaps we do need to be wiped out to start over. This gives me that article gives me such little faith for the future of the human race. So perhaps it is time we hit the reset button.
Well, and we predicted it, actually, in this show last week, that the coronavirus would wipe out all of humanity in the last 7 or 8 seconds. You have to go back and watch last week's episode, where yours truly made the formal prediction that that was going to happen. I thought it would happen by now, but we've got a couple more weeks, so we'll see. All right. Well, that's the show for this week. Don't forget to go to westernstandardonline.com, become a member today, and subscribe. Find us on YouTube if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, and find us on your favorite podcast app if you're listening to us on YouTube. Did I say that right? Thanks for joining us today, Derek from Calgary, and Dave also from Calgary. And we'll see you guys on the range very soon.
Thanks, Paul. I'm off to have a Corona now.